Welcome to the Enjoy a Cancer-Free Life podcast with Dr. Ted Koren, best-selling author of Cancer is Natural, So is the Cure. More than care for patients, Dr. Koren transforms lives. He teaches people an all-natural way to heal from and address the causes of cancer using the tools we all have within ourselves. On the podcast, Dr. Koren interviews other thought leaders in natural healing who share insights and information to help you live longer and better.
I'd like to welcome everyone to our latest podcast based on the book Cancer is Natural, So is the Cure. And I'm here with one of the most exciting interviewees I've had the pleasure of meeting, and that is Dr. Linda Isaacs, who has been doing incredible work for over 20 years in the field of chronic diseases and cancer. Dr. Isaacs, can you give us a little bit about your background?
Well, sure. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to be with your audience today. I appreciate it. I'm a graduate of Vanderbilt University Medical School, and I'm also board certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine. But I actually got into the line of work that I'm in because when I was a medical student, I met somebody named Dr. Gonzalez. He was already engaged in research about a practitioner that worked in the alternative medicine, nutrition, cancer field. And based on what I learned and what I heard about in the records that Nick was going through, that persuaded me that this work needed to be followed up on, and that changed the direction of my career.
That must have been very persuasive because so much is different about your perspective when you get into alternative cancer care.
Well, that's certainly true. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of value in the orthodox approaches to some cancers. There are some situations where things like surgery or even chemotherapy or radiation can be the best option for a particular patient. But overall, I would say that cancer medicine has not been the success that was envisioned when the war on cancer was declared in the 1970s. And so there's a lot of room for other approaches, other things that patients can try, and that's part of what got me into this field. But again, Nick was investigating the work of a man named Dr. William Donald Kelly, who was treating patients with large amounts of pancreatic enzymes, and a nutritional program that involved other things as well, like diet and detoxification. But with this protocol, there were patients that were alive that unquestionably should have been dead years earlier. And that's what Nick was finding in Dr. Kelly's records. And so that, is what persuaded me and persuaded Nick as well to go in a different direction with our lives.
So can you tell us a little bit about Dr. Kelly? Didn't he base his work on a Dr. Beard from Scotland?
Well, Dr. Kelly was an orthodontist by training, and he'd gotten interested in nutrition based on the fact that he was having children come into his office to have their crooked teeth straightened, but their parents had perfect teeth. And he would ask them, well, didn't you need braces? And they said, no, my teeth were just fine. He then, doing a little investigation, found the work of Weston A. Price. And you and I both spoke at one of those conferences, so you're already familiar with Dr. Price's work and how it showed that if parents ate poor quality food, children would be born with crooked teeth. So Kelly developed an interest in nutrition, but then that got stimulated when he himself got sick with what was almost certainly pancreatic cancer. He lost a huge amount of weight and had a tumor in his abdomen. This was the early 1960s, and so there were no CAT scans or needle biopsies, but it was presumed that he had pancreatic cancer. He started taking large amounts of enzymes because pancreatic enzymes can help with digestion, and he was having horrible indigestion. But what he found when he started taking them is that the nature of the tumor started to change. That made him wonder if pancreatic enzymes might have a role against cancer. And then he found the work of Dr. John Beard, who had speculated and theorized many years earlier that pancreatic enzymes could and did have a role in the management of cancer. So that's where the Beard connection came in. Really, Kelly said, just purely serendipitously, he tried large amounts of enzymes trying to address his digestion, and found that they were addressing his cancer.
So the enzymes were digesting his cancer.
That's what we speculate. I mean, the exact molecular mechanism, of course, would require large amounts of basic science researchers doing things in test tubes. And there isn't a whole lot of money in the concept of pancreatic enzymes treating cancer because people have been trying that for more than 100 years. So there's no patent there. But it turns out, Beard had speculated that enzymes had a role in treating cancer. It now turns out that there are receptors on the surfaces of the cancer cells that, like receptors are like little catcher's mitts. So it turns out there are receptors that pancreatic enzymes will fit neatly into on the surfaces of cancer cells. That would suggest that they're doing something. And so what we believe is that they're influencing the cell in some way to lead it to be broken up and gotten rid of.
Now, your work also has to do with detoxification. If I remember right, as the tumor dies off, people can get very sick and even die. So how does detoxification fit into your protocol?
It's extremely important. Sometimes people will hear about the enzymes and think that's all that matters. But what Kelly found and what we've observed over the years is that if people take large amounts of pancreatic enzymes but don't do detoxification, they'll start to develop all sorts of flu-like symptoms, aches and pains, nausea, even get to the point where they can't continue their enzymes. So that's where Kelly found that doing a particular detoxification routine called enemas was able to help him to stay on his protocol and eventually get better. So coffee enemas are the backbone of what we recommend for getting rid of what we believe are the waste materials that form as the enzymes do their work.
Is a coffee enemas the only kind of detoxification protocol that you use?
That's the backbone on a day-to-day basis, but we also recommend things like liver gallbladder flushes, another thing that's been in the alternative world for many years, a way to help the liver and gallbladder clear out. We use a product or a protocol rather that includes some psyllium and chia seeds that help clear the intestinal tract. And then as saunas have become more affordable, I've been recommending them very highly to my patients. They're more commonly available and more affordable for people to actually have in their homes.
Yes, I've found that there's portable far infrared saunas that you can close up and put behind the desk or a dresser, open up and use it.
Exactly. So there's a lot more options as far as promoting a good sweat, which is a good way to get rid of things. And there are some things that come out better in sweat than any other way.
So did Beard, Kelly, Dr. Gonzalez, did they talk about the causes of cancer?
Well, Beard actually speculated that cancer came about as a result of residual cells in the body from something that's known as the trophoblast. And we're about to get a little technical here, but the trophoblast is the precursor to what's called the placenta in development. The placenta is the connection between mother and baby. Beard was an embryologist by training. And he had noticed that the early stage of the placenta, called the trophoblast, looks and acts a lot like cancer. It invades, it creates a blood supply. Cancer does those things as well. But at a certain point in development, the trophoblast stops invading the mother's uterus, matures, and turns into the placenta. And then at delivery, it neatly peels itself off and leaves the uterus intact. But cancer just keeps going. And so Beard speculated that if he could find the signal that made the trophoblast stop invading, he would find a particular solution for cancer. And so what he found was that the one thing that was happening around the time that the trophoblast changed character was that the baby started making pancreatic enzymes. And this is well before the baby's going to see a meal. So those enzymes were not there to digest food, but they were there, he speculated, to control the behavior of the trophoblast. Now, to go back to your question, what Beard speculated was that there are cells throughout the body that are derived from the same trophoblast type materials. he thought that they were probably there to provide a reservoir for replacement of aging cells, cells that needed to be replaced.
What we refer to that as stem cells today, or is it
That's
slightly?
what they would call stem cells.
So he
Exactly.
discovered stem cells.
I would say he discovered stem cells.
When was that about? It was in the 1800s, I think.
He passed away in 1922. His main book, his seminal book that summarized everything that he had to say, was published in 1911, called the oh goodness, the enzyme treatment of cancer and its scientific basis. I may have mangled that slightly, but that was his seminal work, published in 1911. So he was way before his time. He claimed to be able to see these wayward trophoblast cells, as he called them, with a microscope. But other scientists said, we don't know what he's talking about. I think he just had a really good set of eyes. And apparently he was not the most interesting person, so to speak. In other words, the man didn't have a life. So he probably spent a lot more time in the laboratory than a lot of other people would have. And that's what helped him make all these brilliant discoveries.
You know, they say that about Warburg also, that he was a real kook in some ways, eccentric as they'll put it. But their life was the lab.
Yes, and their passion and their joy came from looking for answers and finding those answers. And they can be, a little strange to those of us who have a wider set of interests, but they also provide something incredibly valuable.
Why would some people not get cancer and others get cancer? Now, when Beard was studying his work, cancer was still a fairly rare disease. First of all, why was he interested in that subject if it was so rare? But you can't answer that, I'm sure. Well, maybe you can. But why would so few people get cancer then? Now, of course, so many more are.
Well, I think Beard got interested in cancer because he had looked at cancer specimens under the microscope at one point or another in his training. And then as he was studying this early stage of embryonic development, the trophoblast, he said, oh, that looks like cancer. In other words, he remembered what he had seen. And bear in mind, the microscopic study of cancer goes way back. A lot of the techniques and things that are used to diagnose are exactly the same as it would have been in his era in terms of slicing and staining and looking at it under the microscope. It's not like, as Nick used to say, it's not like that era, scientists lived in caves. They actually had a lot of techniques that are still used today. So Beard would have already seen cancer and instead recognized its similarities, something he was seeing in embryology. But Beard's belief, and based on what I've seen mine as well, is that cancer develops if the body simply doesn't have enough pancreatic enzymes to get what pancreatic enzymes do done. That they're part of the surveillance mechanism for cancer, but they're also used for digestion. And if you think about it, in today's world, how many people have digestive problems? I mean, enormous numbers of people have digestive problems. And pancreatic enzymes, the body is going to use them first for digesting food, and second for cancer surveillance, because one is an immediate issue, the other is a long-term issue. And so if you don't have enough enzymes around, you're going to have digestive problems, but you're also going to develop cancer. That can then lead you into saying, okay, what's different about our food supply that we need so much digestive enzymes to manage it? Well, people eat the wrong foods, they eat poor quality foods, they eat highly processed foods, they don't eat raw food, and all of that's going to mean the food may need more enzymes to digest. And then finally, you throw in environmental influences, because things like smoking, I mean, obviously everybody knows that smoking can influence cells to cause cancer. Well, you might say, well, what about my uncle Hugo, who smoked like a chimney and lived to 99 and never developed cancer? Right. What I say is Hugo had a really good pancreas that was making lots of enzymes that helped clear those cells as quickly as they were made. But somebody else with not as strong a pancreas, they're going to get cancer. Throw in all the many, many, many environmental issues we have now, And that can mean more people's anti-cancer surveillance mechanisms are going to get overwhelmed. So there's several factors, bottom line.
Oh, absolutely. Everything is multifactorial. If it weren't, then it would be easy to practice what we do. Everyone is so unique, and their needs are so unique. Now, that was one of the really fascinating things about Kelly's work that you and Nick Gonzalez worked with, and I would hope perfected, is that you looked at the uniqueness of every person for the nutritional needs.
That's right. And, Dr. Kelly was really the brilliant synthesizer. He was, first of all, a clinician. He saw a lot of different patients and listened to what they said. And he also was a voracious reader. And in some ways, I suppose he was another one that, how much of a life he had outside of his practice is debatable. But he, in the course of his observations, came to the understanding and belief that different people need different things. And so there are some people, for example, that need a more vegetarian diet, not completely vegetarian. There's nothing in our work that would support the idea of a vegan diet, for example, but more on the vegetarian side with not a lot of, or no red meat or poultry, veering all the way over to the other side where there are people that do well with a lot of red meat, a lot of fat in the diet, and very little grains or carbohydrates, and everything in between.
Now, one of the things I heard that Dr. Gonzalez talk about, which I thought was fascinating, and I'm surprised that no one ever asked him further, at least in the interviews I saw, was he talked about the people that were at extremes. Some needed a lot of meat, some needed more vegetables, more plants. And then somebody said to him, what about people that are in the middle? He says, oh, they don't get cancer.
They don't get cancer if they're functioning well. Those are the people that are healthy and they don't come see us because they're healthy. So people whose metabolism is pretty balanced, who do well with a variety of different types of things, don't typically get cancer. Now, sometimes if their health deteriorates, in other words, if their metabolism is still balanced but not terribly healthy, then they would start getting chronic fatigue syndromes, those types of things. Or every now and then we'll see somebody that has a cancer that's more typical of the vegetarian types, and also a cancer of the other type. In other words, they're the unlucky folks that get more than one kind of cancer. But that's not that common a phenomenon in our experience.
What about the microbiome, the intestinal flora? That's been getting a lot of interest lately. Would you relate that to causing the pancreas not to function as well as it could? I'm trying to tie things together as best as I can.
Yeah, sure. Well, I certainly think the microbiome is extremely important, and I'm really glad that the Orthodox world is starting to pay attention to this, because it may mean that they will finally accept the concept that what we eat actually matters. And you even throwing in that with some of the new immune agents in cancer that the Orthodox world is using, that they're finding that the microbiome can help determine whether it works or not for a given patient. So who knows, the oncologist may actually stop serving junk food in their office one of these days. I think that the microbiome probably does tie into this whole influence of somebody does well on a vegetarian or a meat diet. Obviously, that would influence the microbiome. But I think it's a little early for me to be able to answer how well that synthesizes into what I do.
I do wonder when people talk about the tremendous interest in the gut and the intestines and the bacteria and what have the little critters inside of us. Supposedly they are 90% of us in terms of number, which is fascinating. I do wonder this tremendous use of antibiotics in our food supply, and of course, so many kids are given antibiotics, if that is a factor in setting them off course.
Oh, absolutely. I think that that's definitely true. And so it may tie in, Dr. Kelly always recommended organic food, freshly prepared food, unprocessed foods, etc. All of that ties into the microbiome, obviously. The bacteria eat whatever, they digest whatever we didn't, and they are extremely influenced by what foods that we choose to eat. So I think that um, that will help elucidate why eating properly is so important. I don't believe that somebody can make up for a trip to a fast food restaurant by popping probiotics. It's a bit more complicated than that.
Well, speaking of probiotics and all that, that's prebiotics, probiotics are getting a lot of press lately, but I've been talking to naturopaths recently who are convinced that cancer patients have parasites, flukes, mold, all kinds of other creatures that should be dealt with at least as part of the work. Have you noticed anything like that?
Not, I can't say that that's been a major focus of mine or of Dr. Gonzalez over the years. Who knows, it may be a missing piece for the patients, because not everybody does well. I mean, we have many, many case reports of people that have done spectacularly well. That's why we do what we do. But I don't really have a whole lot of background on whether parasites are a huge key.
Oh, okay. I didn't want to put you on the spot. I'm just
No, that's okay.
trying to put everything together.
Interesting question. I guess part of, on a pragmatic level, what we have found over the years is that if you give people enzymes, pancreatic enzymes, as a side benefit, they may help squelch parasites. And that's true for some of the other cleanses as well. If you think about it, my understanding is that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, people would routinely do things like juice fast or cleanses or whatever to get rid of parasites. And so many of the parasite medications are rather toxic. And some of the herbal preparations can be a little toxic as well. So my own personal belief is that the protocol that we have used is probably already doing something about parasites without me going after them and stomping on them, so to speak.
Yeah, I believe that a lot of healing is nonlinear. People say, well, A, B, C, D. It may not be that way at all. Something that you're doing could affect people on many different levels without perhaps your awareness of it.
Yeah, and the other consideration from my point of view is that, sometimes I feel like patients will, they'll say, okay, if I get rid of the parasites, then I can go back to my old way of life. If I get rid of the, whatever, in other words, that there's one factor, and once that's gone, then I can go back to living like everybody else. And I just don't think that's correct. And so I don't tend to go down those particular rabbit holes.
I don't blame you. I had a question about, and Dr. Gonzalez had brought it up. People said he was doing this for the money. And he said, if I want to do it for the money, I would have become a regular oncologist. I don't need these headaches. Does that sound, well, you've got the headaches. You're sticking out there. You're being very courageous in looking at healing from a different perspective. How do you deal with it?
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of we're in it for the money, honestly, it's laughable. I could have been, I'm a board certified internist. I could be doing something else and making a lot more money and having a lot less hassle in my life, so to speak. And so, one of the things that I've always held very strongly to is that I don't make money off supplements. In other words, what I make from a patient is very clearly laid out on my website, and that is it. I don't make any kind of hidden referral fees, and I might add that the oncology world does. Your typical oncologist is getting money from the oncologist is buying the drug that is infused and then charging a higher price for it to the insurance company or to the patient. So a huge amount of oncology payment is actually from the treatment that they prescribe. I don't do that, and so again, to say that I'm in it for the money would be.
Yeah,
Anyone would agree that it's ludicrous if they could see my tax returns. And, why do I do what I do? Well, both of my parents, in retrospect, were people that they put things on the line for what they believed in. I encountered this work, as a medical student, and have since then have seen many, many patients who are, again, alive and well that should have been dead years ago. And I have always believed that I had an intellectual and moral responsibility to continue to offer this, in whatever way that I can, as long as I can, because the work needs to be preserved. I don't know who else there is to do it. And so I chose to pursue a less comfortable way of making a living than many of my medical school classmates. I do not fault them for making the choices that they did, but this is the choice that I made, and that's why.
Has this affected your personal life in terms of your nutrition and your healthcare practices?
Well, I follow my own program, if that's what you mean. I actually got into this not only because of reading remarkable case reports, but also because I myself got sick with a fatigue syndrome when I was about 25 years old. I had been very careless with laboratory chemicals, and I wound up getting sick. I went on this program to get better, and I did. And so that is part of my motivation as well. If I don't follow my own protocol, my health will start to go downhill. And so I have learned over the course of the past 35 years that I better do my own protocol. So I do.
I like that. And in fact, talking about this, a recent study came out, was published in England, that 88% of oncologists, if they had cancer, would not do chemotherapy, even though they recommend it to their patients. Are you familiar with these little studies?
I have heard things like that before. I'm not terribly surprised. I know that, for instance, I heard about somebody a few years back who was a resident where I went to medical school, brilliant guy, and he apparently developed pancreatic cancer and looked at his options, decided not to do any of them, packed up his stuff and went home. And I have continued to feel that it was such a tragedy that Nick's work didn't get, the research that Nick was already doing into Dr. Kelly's work didn't get known about more, because maybe that gentleman would have known there was another option. Maybe he knew and chose not to.
Well, I think that we all have stories like that in our lives. Looking back, what if I had done this with a patient or that? But there is, do you get a lot of medical students coming in to see you or observing you, or interns? Because it would be terrible if this were the last stand of Kelly's method and Gonzalez's methods. And yours, of course.
Right. Well, part of the reason that I recently moved from New York City to Texas was to be able to have a bit more office space at a reasonable rate. New York is such an expensive place to operate. And my own belief is that in order to properly pass this material on, I'm going to need to have people physically in my office for a significant chunk of time. Unfortunately, in the past, while Nick was alive, we tended to have people that wanted to, come to the office for the weekend and start treating patients on Monday, back in their original location, which isn't terribly realistic. So that is certainly my hope. I feel like, it's got to be the right person or people. I hope that they show up sometime soon. But again, people come out of medical school with massive amounts of debt and generally stressed out, and this, like I said, it's meaningful work, but it's not the kind of work that's going to make you a millionaire, and so at least not at the time being. So we'll see, but I am just trusting, when Dr. Kelly, when the stresses of things got to him and he wasn't practicing anymore, that's when Nick came along. Nick is tragically no longer with us, but I'm still here, and I'm just trusting God that he will find the right person and send them in my direction at the right
time. I hope so, because your insights are just wonderful, and more people need to know about them. Are you invited to lecture a lot at medical schools?
No, I've never been invited to lecture at a medical school. Again, this is to many people very controversial work, and it's sad because I think there's so much in Dr. Kelly's system and his model. There's bits and pieces about, for instance, the different people needing different diets that and why that actually makes a lot of medicine fall into place. It makes it make more sense. But it's only recently that the medical world has started to talk about personalization, individualization. And if you think about it, the pharmacology world would like to believe that we're all the same. And so therefore, if person A comes down with high cholesterol and person B comes down with high cholesterol, that the answer is the same for both of them. Because it's simple and it's easy, and you just write a prescription and you sell mega billion dollars worth of whatever the drug is. Individualization is more complicated than that, but it also works better. I hope that the day will come that the medical world is more open to that.
I've been very curious to see the dental connection. Not being a dentist myself, I was exposed to holistic biological dentists, and if you read some of the materials, and Weston Price, of course, he was a dentist, they tied in various cancers to the focal infection theory, that a bad tooth, an infected tooth, could affect an internal organ. Have you found that?
Well, I can't really say that I have a whole lot of data to either confirm or deny that. I know that Nick could sometimes get a little frustrated with that because he had a lot of dental work done not based on symptoms but based on theory, and that caused more problems. So he was actually very wary of having, his approach tended to be if it works, don't fix it, as far as dental work went. We've also seen plenty of patients with cancer who also had perfect teeth. So I don't think it's as perfect a connection as is sometimes said. So the bottom line, I'm not really sure.
Okay, yeah, I think that's why we individualize everything, to find the uniqueness in that person. If people wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do it? I'd like more people to study your work and investigate you.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, my website, which if my virtual background is working properly, they'll be able to see, but it's www.drlindai.com. And on my website, you'll find various articles, various information about what I do, book references, but also if somebody wants to become a patient, it'll tell them what to do. I ask people to send in some information about themselves for me to review, and I don't charge for that review process. I only charge if somebody becomes a patient. So that review process is all described on the website.
Where do people come from? Do you get people from all over the U.S.?
Yes, we've always gotten people from all over the U.S. I mean, there is a concentration of people in the New York area, as you might expect, but I'm still keeping up with all those folks, either by going back to New York, or we'll see what happens with the whole COVID-19 situation. But I can still see people virtually, by telemedicine. But, believe it or not, I have patients in the People's Republic of China. I have patients in Australia. I have patients all over the world, literally. And so it's people hear about it and come from long distances.
Do you ever meet any of Kelly's old patients? Because he practiced in Texas, right?
He did. I've been contacted by a few people who said that their mother or their grandmother were treated by Kelly. And just bear in mind, of course, Kelly really stopped seeing patients to any large degree in the early to mid 80s. So it's been a while at this point. I have not actually met anybody that saw Kelly personally here lately, although I think there's a few patients in the practice that that did see Dr. Kelly. But, a few years ago, I actually contacted one of the people that was in Nick's book about Dr. Kelly's work, the patients that he found in Kelly's records. She is a woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer I think she was in her late 30s. She wound up having bilateral mastectomies, and then a few years later, in the mid-70s, was found to have bone metastases that were causing her terrible pain. She went on Dr. Kelly's program, and at the time that Nick finished his research project, she was alive and well 11 years later. Well, I decided to see if I could track her down in 2016 because she has an unusual name. I thought it might be worth trying to give her a call. And I actually spoke with her. I found her, and she was doing great, and was extremely glad that she had found Dr. Kelly, and that Nick, and then at that point myself, were continuing to work. So that was a nice, remarkable long-term outcome. That was really, really a lot of fun to talk to her.
Oh, and I'm glad people in this podcast get to hear that story. I've always been inspired by testimonials and clinical stories. I wonder, why aren't more people doing your work? Why aren't more people looking at natural ways, detox, nutrition? I'm just blown away by it. Is it just because of the cultural bias?
I believe so. I can't really speak for why people do what they do, but I think that we all, I guess right at the moment, I hate to date your podcast, so to speak, but right at the moment, we're in the midst of this whole COVID-19 thing. And, even listening to people arguing versus staying in the home versus going out and what should we be doing, and they have all these different arguments. The people, unfortunately, tend to, just human nature, decide what they believe and then look for evidence to support it. And unfortunately, having been in the medical world, I can tell you that a lot of people in the medical world do not eat very well. And they eat a lot of processed food and junk food, and they would really like to believe that that's okay. And they would really like to not have the conversations with their patients about that. And the patients would really like to believe that that's okay. And so you have a giant world that wants to think that what you eat doesn't matter. And unfortunately, I'm here to say that it matters desperately. And what people had available to eat 150 years ago was pretty good quality because that's all they had.
Yeah, I remember the phrase, what did they call organic food 100 years ago? 150? They called it food.
They called it food, exactly. And, they didn't have, supposedly I once heard that a medieval peasant in Europe would get more B vitamins from their food than we do.
Oh, I believe that. We put things in foods to, as I like to say, to increase their shelf life, but it doesn't help our shelf life.
That's a good way of putting it, exactly. So in fact, we have a cultural delusion that this is okay. And so there's going to be a hesitancy to believe that something like what I do could actually be correct, because that means we have to change. And it used to drive Nick crazy, that the data that we have would be dismissed as anecdotal, whereas if it was the same data for some new magic cancer bullet drug, that the drug would be approved and shouted from the housetop about how wonderful it is.
Exactly. It all comes down to belief, cultural bias. And I think that ties into something I heard Dr. Gonzalez talk about, in which he said one of the most important things determining whether or not a patient will get better is their family support.
That's right. You see, this protocol requires that people take a lot of steps every day to maintain their health. And if they're in the middle of a culture where the message they're getting is, oh, that's stupid, or oh, that doesn't matter, or you shouldn't be doing that, or you should be doing something else, or we'll just humor you until you die, whatever that message might be, if they're getting a lot of negativity in their surroundings, it's going to be hard to implement the program properly. That's part of it. I also believe that negativity and depression and all those things have a direct physical effect on the body. And so, yes, it's important for a patient to, in an ideal situation, they have support from family members.
Thank you. This has been very enlightening, and I appreciate everything you've been telling me. And it ties in so much to what we've been talking about in other podcasts. I wish you much success. Thank you for your courage. And I hope more people get turned on to you and you get invited to a lot of medical schools.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Do you need money to fund your idea, product, or service? Are you ready to take your business to the next level but need capital to get it done? Kevin Harrington has heard more than 50,000 pitches and knows how to help you make the perfect pitch to get the funding for your entrepreneurial dream. He's distilled the process down in his perfect pitch cheat sheet, and it's yours for free. Just text PITCH to him right now at 727-888-2100. Text PITCH to 727-888-2100 right now and claim your free perfect pitch cheat sheet. Text PITCH to 727-888-2100 to start funding your dream today.
This show has been produced by Market Domination, LLC. To discover how you can have your own show completely done for you and turn it into a real published book and become the authority in your marketplace, go to www.marketdominationllc.com/podcast offer.